What? Not that. Are you like turn about it? I'm afraid of failing to entertain millions. But it's not me. Yeah, I'm afraid of like something which has never happened for the record. But if I do, yeah. And he like finds himself unable to so he's just like at the gym and that's like all he can do is like make like real verbal sounds and that's like funny. So what's been happening? You can explain. I do think once it hits 9, I'm gonna start. There's gonna be some people coming late. Normally we start like 10 minutes late. But because of confusion and me having to get out, I'm gonna make it early. Not that many people came at 8:30. I came at like way early. Hey everyone, can you hear me? The microphone's on? Yes, great. Hi, Rachel, are we good? Yes, okay, awesome. Hi everyone, welcome to Night Owls. Let me just say how this is gonna go, and then I have like a few business notes, and then we're gonna jump right in. So I am going to ask Becca some questions for about like 40 minutes, maybe a little more than 40 minutes if I indulge myself. And then we'll have a little break for more cookies and hot chocolate. And then we'll come back and then you guys get to ask us questions. Everyone who asks a question gets a tote bag or t-shirt, depending on which you want and which we have. There's a lot more Night Owls this quarter. This is our most Night Owls quarter ever. So we have a Doc Films event on the movie Taste of Cherry on January 29th, amazing movie about suicide. We have economist Robin Hanson is coming to talk to us about so many things. He's going to give 3 talks and then do a Night Owls. It's going to be like a Hanson Palooza. Very exciting. That's February 6th to 9th. And then we have another Night Owls movie event on the movie Banshees of Inisherin that just came out last year. Great movie. Arnold Brooks, my husband, is going to be talking to me about that. Okay, and we're going to go until 11:30. We can't quite go till midnight because of we need to clear out of this room, basically. But if you want to leave before then, you can leave whenever you want. You can get up whenever you want and get more cookies or whatever. This isn't a class, so you can come back later if you want. It's up to you. One more announcement. So Becca and I are both deeply embedded in The Point magazine, which is a fantastic magazine for sort of literature, culture, philosophy, public philosophy. We've both written for it. Becca, you're an editor now.
A contributing editor. I don't get this. Contributing editor? Yeah, okay.
And The Point is starting a new kind of collaboration with the, what's it called? Parecia, which is a part of the college that also funds Night Owls here at the University of Chicago. And it's called the Point Program for Public Thinking. And it's a kind of mashup of academia, journalism, and cultural criticism. And they're, for instance, this summer, their first big thing is going to be like a summer school that you can apply to that's fully funded. So there are flyers about that at the front. And if you're interested, you should grab one. And there's going to be lots of other stuff to come from them. Okay, so I'm going to start by reading a quote from Becca. Okay. When do writers find the time to do any actual writing? It sometimes seems as though they're always speaking, delivering lectures, pontificating in bookshops, opining on talk shows. If they're lucky enough to win awards, they clear their throats and make grateful remarks. When the books they've somehow secreted between their speaking engagements are at last released, they discuss their inspirations and their process on podcasts or radio shows. More and more, the life of a professional author involves not writing, but talking. Later in the same essay, Becca proclaims, for a confirmed anti-talker like myself, it is hard to resist the temptation to declare the era of the podcast uniquely debased. So my first question is, tell us who you are and why you're here.
Is this like correct? Like the right distance from my face and everything?
You can all hear Becca?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
I'm Becca. I'm a writer. I've written lots of stuff. I'm nominally getting a PhD in philosophy. I'm here because the irony was irresistible, and because the pressure is low. Since I've declared myself an anti-talker, if I end up saying anything stupid or that I don't believe, I can just say, well, I don't believe in talking anyway. Or if I collapse and have like a panic attack and find myself unable to talk, which like could happen, then I can say I won the debate. The point is proven. But mostly because I like Agnes and I like the point and I wanted to promote it. And I don't know. I like talking to Agnes in private.
All right, we'll see whether that transfers over to public. So one claim you make, one sort of grudging allowance you make for speech is that it allows for direct confrontation. Do you think that writers don't benefit as much from confrontation?
No, I mean, I guess I should have said actually that it allows for immediate confrontation, but I think writing like also allows, I was thinking about, I was like rereading my essay because I've forgotten like what I said. And I was like, well, writing also allows for confrontation. And I should have said that. It just allows for confrontation at a slower pace, which I think allows confrontation to be more thoughtful. Like exchanges in writing, I much prefer to participate in and to read.
So one of the grounds you give is that in some sense you see writing as being more malleable. So you said that conversation does not allow for revision or retraction, and that conversation extorts immediate responses, but does not permit us to mull over our replies or to sharpen the terms in which they're expressed. So I found that surprising because I normally think of talking as more malleable than writing.
I mean, I guess I just mean that like you have more time to think about what you actually believe. I mean, I think the mistake people make is taking things that people say to be expressive of their beliefs. So if people lowered their standards for conversation, I might have less of a problem with it. Because I sort of only know what I think, like when I reflected on it for long periods of time. So when an immediate response is demanded of me, I feel like I just blurt out like whatever's off the top of my head is like I'm currently doing. So it's not always representative of what I find I believe upon reflection. But I guess you could just say in the course of conversation, like I'm retracting what I said earlier, which would make it more malleable. Maybe I'll do that.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking of. I mean, that conversation allows you to figure out what you think.
I think that as a means of figuring out what you think, conversation is pretty good, but as a means of expressing your considered opinions, it's not very good. And it's often mistaken to be a means of expressing your considered opinions. And that's the problem. Like you'll see people quoting like writers' interviews as if they have any idea what the fuck they're saying and as if they like believe anything they're saying. And like they don't, they're just making it up as they go along. I mean, I speak for myself.
But so, I mean, suppose you've really figured out what you think about something, right? Wouldn't you be good at talking about it and wouldn't you say it consistently because that's really what you think?
I mean, that might be true, but I feel like under the pressure to like respond immediately, people just like find themselves blurting like all kinds of things, and they might have to answer a question that they haven't like considered before. So I feel like writing is more expressive of what people like actually think and gives them like time to like reflect upon it. I also find that like I in conversation, because I'm like a uniquely like horrible and perverse person, like slip into roles, like want to win arguments, like hate to lose face. And so we'll often like double down on something that like from a distance I can say, I don't really believe that. Like often with my husband, who I think is watching this, I'll just be like, I want to win this fight. Like McIntyre's an idiot. Yeah. But then upon reflection, I'll be like, maybe not.
So I think of that as how to figure out what you think. Like what I mean is, you know, maybe there's stuff I say to myself in my head and I have a view of what my views are, but then I'll just adopt some position I don't at all believe, right? And then, but then I, you know, maybe you'll defend it and then maybe you'll be like, actually, that was pretty good. What I just came out with, like, I think that's my new view. And I don't think I would have arrived at that new view. I don't think I would have had the occasion or even the courage to explore it if I didn't just like jump into it with the other person.
I mean, I guess there's one question is like, is it salutary for like writers to talk to figure out what they think? And another question is like, is it good for readers to listen to writers talk if the interest that readers have is in figuring out what writers think? So it might be good for writers to engage in talking like in private to figure out what they think. But I think that if your interest as a reader is in figuring out what the writer really believes and or in just like listening to someone expressing a view that's well considered, you would be better served by reading the things that the person writes.
What if what you want to do is sort of hear somebody's thinking? Like that is, there's such a thing as thoughts, and then there's such a thing as the process of thinking. And maybe people are interested in being spectators of thinking.
I mean, I think that's your interest. Well, I mean, first of all, I think that some essays, maybe some of the best essays, like sort of, I don't know, get thinking in motion, like onto the page. So I think that that can be just as well accomplished, maybe at a slower pace, like in print. Someone, I'm forgetting who said philosophy is like thought in slow motion, which is something that I think about a lot and like think is really true. So I think that can happen in writing. I mean, I guess if that's your interest in kind of just seeing people like flail around, like figuring out what they believe, which like could be entertaining, then you could watch people talk. But I think a lot of people like want to hear writers talking because they think that it's the same skill set. Like they think, I like this person's writing, so I'll like their talking because the two things are correlated, and the way that they present themselves on the page is the way that they act interpersonally. And I just think that like that's not true. That's a mistake. So I guess if you approach listening to a writer talk with like completely different expectations, and you're like, this person who's good at writing might just be absolutely ineloquent, bumbling idiot in person, and I kind of just want to like watch that spectacle, then that's a fine motivation.
Yeah, you have this great, I'm just going to read another passage so that we also get Becca, the writer, showing up here. So one of your heroes in the writers not talking regard is Nabokov, because he refused to do interviews except by writing, by written exchanges, or by reading out loud stuff he had written down. You write, it's demoralizing enough that even Nabokov sometimes degenerated into inarticulate normalcy. There's no need to add insult to injury by documenting or publicizing his lapses. The reader's mania for catching writers speaking is worse than misguided or voyeuristic. It's downright sadistic. The literary equivalent of the paparazzi's fetish for capturing celebrities in compromising poses. So I kind of want to invite you to expand on that. Like, you might, like, is the reason, so I was saying maybe we like to hear people think. Maybe we like to hear writers be normal and stupid. Like, do you think that's part of the appeal of like the era of the podcast?
I definitely think that's part of it. I mean, I think another part of it is just that people have sort of parasocial relationships to like the brand that is the writer, and writers are less writers nowadays than they are personas who incidentally like engage in writing. And so people think that they're like engaging with the persona. So both motivations, maybe there's like some sadism involved, or I think that people are kind of just mistaken about the correlation between being good at and enjoying writing and being good at and enjoying talking. Like people think that they're like closely related skill sets, which like maybe I would have thought at one time, that now that I'm called upon to talk, I'm like, oh no, I'm terrible at this.
So, okay, here's one way we might divide people into, what's up?
Oh, okay. Do I have to be this close? Can I be this close? Okay.
You could also move it closer to you. Thanks.
Is this good? Okay. It's kind of weird to just like have it in your face, but that's okay.
Okay. So, okay. So I was thinking we could divide people in the world into writers and talkers. I mean, not everyone is either a writer or a talker, but I was thinking, that like critics, novelists, academics, maybe they're writers. And then like, I happen to be reading a book right now about the sociology of corporate management. Managers are definitely talkers. Like they do not want stuff in writing because they want to be able to change what happened later. But like salespeople, politicians, like all those people are talkers, right? So do you have like, I don't know, some kind of generalization about what is it to be a talker and what is it to be a writer?
I don't necessarily know that I do. I mean, I think that writers are people who are often, I mean, this is at least true in my personal case, like people who are unsatisfied with the imprecision and immediacy of talking. And so people who who want to slow talking down and who feel that they're like often called upon to offer their thoughts too quickly. So I think that one thing that drives somebody to become a writer is dissatisfaction with and ineptitude at speaking. I have less of a theory of people who are good at talking because honestly, I try to like avoid talking types. I suppose I'm just
Except
alone
me.
writing all the time, so I'm not interacting with them much.
So it's interesting that you say you seem to really like stuff being slow. Like you're like, well, writers get to do it slowly. And I like stuff being fast. And that's why I like reading, because when I talk to people, they only say like a few ideas at a time. And I'm like, come on, say more ideas, say more ideas. Whereas when I read, I get like a lot of ideas in a short time.
I mean, I'm also quite a fast person. Like I speak really quickly and I get really impatient when people like speak really slowly, which is actually one of the things that I don't like about talking to people. Like they'll begin like a thought experiment and I'm like, I see the point. Like, we just cut to the end of the thought experiment. So maybe it's a way of like militating against my own really crappy tendency, which is sort of like to rush through things and to think things like too quickly. Because I find myself in a conversation convincing myself that I believe something because it's the most interesting position to take, and then doubling down because I'm like the kind of horrible person who like insists upon winning like every argument that I enter into. And so I think that it's only by forcing myself to slow down against my natural tendency that I can figure out what I actually think upon reflection. Because like all positions or like a wide range of positions are defensible, I think. Okay, of those, like, which do I believe? I don't know. In a conversation, I'll often just like pick the provocative one because like, why not? Or like pick the one that annoys my husband because like, that's fun. But then like, do I actually believe that? Like, I don't know.
I mean, there's a weird way in which you might think it just doesn't matter what you actually believe. That is like, there's you, Becca, right? And then there's a question, what views shall we affiliate with Becca? And that's important if we have like a
Becca construct.
Yeah, a Becca construct, this like persona of Becca that has to have views attached to it. But we might just want Becca to interest us, right? And then when she defends like this crazy view, but defends it really well that we would otherwise disagree with, and like that writers shouldn't talk, then we're just like, wow, that's interesting. You know, that helps me think, or something like that. And why does it matter whether it's like your considered view?
I guess because I don't know if I think this, but I'm trying it on. I think that a critic is sort of like a character, and that as a critic, you're kind of like constructing a heteronym for yourself in the way that like Pessoa or Kierkegaard did. Like you're trying to have like a critical sensibility that you are very deliberately aestheticizing, stylizing, and constructing. And so I feel like that requires you to have some level of consistency and not just to be like a bundle of like ad hoc offshoots. And that's how one often is in conversation. And sort of the part of the appeal of writing or like any sort of art making is that you have the ability to construct yourself into like a better, more interesting, more aestheticized persona. And some people, I guess, can do that like really adequately via in-person performance, but I'm not one of those people.
Okay, this is interesting because like earlier you seem to be putting down the whole like parasocial relationship that we have to public figures, where like, you know, a writer will then have a public persona and then people want to like engage with that public persona. But in a way, you're saying the critic has to construct that, right? So it's almost like the critic is just very flirtatious. Like they want to put this public persona before us, but then they don't want to let us get too close to it.
Or they want to have control over it. It's like I want to have a public persona like qua writer, but that doesn't mean I want to have a public persona like qua everything. Like I want to have control over my medium, I guess, as like a person interested in constructing my life into like an art object. And so like speaking is not my medium, and I've decided that like tweeting is not my medium, like writing is my medium. And so like I want to have control over my medium. But the problem is that like people are now expected and like called upon in the course of marketing their books and their writing to sort of, they no longer have control over their medium. They're supposed to be adept at every medium. And like that's what being a brand is, I guess, is like.
Okay, so I want to run something by you. I had a thought about when I was asking myself, which category do academics belong in? Are we talkers or are we writers? I put us in the writers category, but I'm like, well, obviously as like a teacher, I'm doing a lot of talking. But I think that, especially if I think about lecturing, it's a funny kind of talking. And so we can put this hypothesis before you of like a way I was thinking about the difference between writers and talkers. It seems to me that when you are writing for an idealized audience, like for your ideal reader. And I think often when I'm teaching, I do this a little bit. Like I was actually just remarking on this to someone today that sometimes when I'm teaching something really hard, okay, this happened yesterday. There's some people in my Aristotle class in here. Like I was doing this stuff, Aristotle's Physics 1.7, which is like his account of how Parmenides is wrong and he's right and there's change. It's so hard. I have to concentrate really hard on it. That in those contexts, I actually avoid looking at the students' faces because I do not want to see incomprehension on those faces. I cannot deal. Okay. I know I haven't done that great a job, but I have to somehow imagine an ideal world where everyone has just understood what I said. And I think that there's a way in which writers write in that kind of ideal world, but that in a conversation, you have to actually look and be like, okay, does Becca get what I'm saying? Is she nodding? Right. So there's this kind of being mired in reality that speaking puts you just face to face with an actual person who may or may not hear what you said. And you had to say it to them, not to an ideal person.
But only some forms of speaking do that. Because I mean, I guess it's a hybrid, because in this conversation, I'm talking both to you and to the people in the audience and to the people who I can't see who are like live streaming this, hopefully not many, because that would be terrifying. So it's like sort of like the confusion of audiences. That's like one problem. I also think that some people do write with like a particular audience in mind. I suppose I'm like not really one of them. So I mean, maybe that is like sort of a difference. But I guess I don't know that I speak with like particular audiences in mind either. Even when I'm in a conversation with someone, I'm kind of just in a conversation. My interest is in figuring out like what I think. It's like a pretty selfish endeavor. Whereas in writing, I'm trying to like articulate my thought with like an eye towards like a charitable reader, whoever they are, like filling it in. Is that true 100% of the time? I don't know. I don't know if things I say are true, but at least sometimes that's true.
I mean, you were saying earlier that you want to win the argument. And it seems to me in order to win the argument, you have to attend to the person you're talking to.
Sort of. I mean, I think you have to respond to the content of what they're saying, but whether or not you convince them is sometimes like separate from whether you win the argument. Like I want to know that I've won the argument. And if they're not convinced, so much the worse for them sometimes. It's a bad tendency, which is why talking is not my medium.
Okay, I want to jump to ask you some questions about Kafka.
Okay.
So Becca just wrote this really great review. Kafka's diaries were just published and translated in a new version, and Becca wrote a review in the New Yorker. And I kind of want, one question I had was just, should writers write diaries?
Depends. I don't know that I would advise writing diaries the way that Kafka wrote diaries, because his diaries are full of infelicities, like grammatical infelicities, like incomplete sentences, things that if I were Kafka, I wouldn't want everybody to see, even though I found them like very interesting, because Kafka's finished writing is so cool and icy and impenetrable that it's like exciting to see Kafka in the process of writing and in the act of it. But for someone who writes for the reasons that I write, which is because they're like impatient with the imprecisions and infelicities of speaking, if a diary is going to mimic those imprecisions and infelicities, it's not going to achieve the ends that I want for my writing. So I would not want to keep a diary, because I want my thoughts to reach my audience in a perfected form.
So it's like there's a question about your ends, and then there's a question about like your audience's ends in relation to you, right?
Yeah.
And so like you're happy Kafka wrote those diaries because you got to read them.
It's a voyeuristic impulse, much like the sadistic impulse that I think drives. I mean, that's part of it. There's lots of other reasons I have respect for Kafka. I'm not just like a sadist in relation to him, but part of it is like the sadistic, voyeuristic desire to see somebody who appears in such a polished form, unpolished and disintegrating for once.
There's a quote that you cite from Kafka. I am nothing but literature and can and want to be nothing else. So this quote is, as you tell us in the piece, it was written in a letter to someone and the person never got the letter, okay? So it like, Kafka didn't try to publish that sentence. It was in a letter. And Becca, you comment on this. The formulation is memorable, but it is not true. Kafka was, in addition to literature, a person with a history, a family, and a body. Once he had even been a baby.
True. Unlikely, but true.
And so you have this vantage point on Kafka as a whole person. Do you think that it's like because he's a novelist that truth about him seems more like, let's say, legitimate to emphasize than you as a critic?
No, I mean, I think it's kind of like a battle. Like the writer wants to aestheticize themselves as much as possible, or at least succeed in deluding their audience into believing that they are their self-aestheticization. And then critics and audience members might have like sadistic, voyeuristic impulses. And we're indulging those in reading an author's diaries or an author's letters, I think. And it satisfies us as critics, but like as a writer, it's not in your interest, I guess, to leave shoddy documents lying around. So I mean, Kafka, of course, didn't want to. He wanted all of his stuff to be burned.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I mean, this is what I'm wondering about. Like, do writers know what's in their own interest? That is, it will not appear to the writer to be in their interest to leave such things around. So I want to read another passage. You describe an introduction to these diaries. You say that the aim is to capture the extent to which the diaries were a laboratory for Kafka's literary production, and thereby catch the author in the act of writing.
These are the translator's words in his introduction, not mine.
Yeah, sorry. This is Ross Benjamin. Now we get to Becca. He has succeeded. Everything in the diary thrashes. From one draft to the next, characters squirm into new shapes. Phrases are mutilated and mangled back together. So like, in a way, that's like your worst nightmare, right? Somebody like, seeing you working on your phrases and like taking this sentence that you perfectly crafted and looking at all its earlier versions of it. So, I mean, do you see that as just an adversarial process then between the writer and the reader? And like, don't you, I feel like in this piece, you implicitly come down on the side of the reader who has an interest in seeing this kind of living thinking, like seeing Kafka squirm in that way.
I'm not sure. I haven't thought about this before. I mean, I think you're doing like a kind of injustice to the writer whose like life's work is like promoting this delusion of themselves as like appearing in this sort of finished form. So maybe it's just like a base voyeuristic impulse that I have, that I want to know how the sausage is made. And I guess that's a personal preference or something. I mean, I also enjoy engaging with art when I don't know how the sausage is made. So like, I don't know anything about music, so I really enjoy listening to music. I find it like super calming because I'm not ting, how did he make that sentence work? And how did he get his publisher to like allow, like to get him to print that? Like, how did he get an agent with a book that bad? Like, why did he have this publisher? Like, I know how that publisher works. I just have no idea. And that's like restful. So perhaps it is in the reader's interest in some way to not try to peek too far behind the curtain and to preserve the illusion.
When I was an undergrad here, Kurt Vonnegut came and gave a talk, and I had been a big fan of his, so of course I went. And he gave this talk about, and now I'm just drawing on my memory from many decades ago, but it was like graphing novels, and like mapping. Someone told me recently this is like online, you can watch it or something. Anyway, it struck me as incredibly dumb. Like I was like, wow, this is how you think about novels, and I was extremely disillusioned. And I was like, wow, I thought Kurt Vonnegut was like genius, but turns out he has really dumb views about novels. I'm not gonna read his novels anymore. Okay, so this is kind of like your worst fear, right? Of like exposure. But now I'm like wondering, why did I make that inference? Like, why are we? Like, maybe I had just elevated Vonnegut too much to start out with. Like maybe our impression, like writers create this like illusion of genius, and then it's exposed when they talk. But you might think instead of the corrective being writers not talking, maybe the corrective should be we all read Plato and we realize that writers don't actually understand that much.
Yeah, I mean, that might be, or we might just like, I don't know, revise our expectations and think writers do understand things, but they come to understand things in writing, and we shouldn't hold them to the standards of their speech, of their often like inadequate speech. I think maybe it's more the way that speech figures into the way we think about writers than like writers talking itself that bothers me. It's because I have like a fear of being held to the answers that I give off the top of my head that I later decide are not true or that I don't want to stand by. That's like the source of my own personal fear in talking, is that I'm going to say something that I think is stupid upon consideration, but then be like held to it forever. Whereas in writing, I have control over whether that happens or not.
Well, I wonder what it would mean to be held to it forever.
I mean, what it would mean is for somebody to screenshot it, which they can't do if it's in speech, but like record it and then post it on Twitter for all eternity, being like, Becca once said that like she's not a progressive, which for the record I am. So screenshot that.
Well, all they have to do is edit it. So, okay, but like suppose they said that and now it's online forever, and then some people think it, and what's the next step of why that's so bad?
I mean, this I think is just the product of like my own like absolutely enormous like deep paranoia, which arises from like socioeconomic conditions yielding like great precarity for writers and is probably totally not reflective of reality. Like my worst case scenario is like people realize I'm a Rawlsian and they realize I'm not a Marxist and they cancel my book contract and my life is over and I can like never write again. And I have to like become like a grifter on Substack and like only have contrarian opinions. That's my worst nightmare. Will that happen when people learn that I'm like a left liberal? Like probably not, but like that's how it feels sometimes. Probably just because like I'm crazy. I don't think that has like any philosophical like upshot.
Okay, but let me say that for a moment though, because I like that, right? So there's a certain kind of risk that you take when you speak publicly. You say stuff. I said something about throwing in my kids' Halloween candy, and like Twitter went nuts, right? And that's never going to go away. I mean, people are just going to bring that back like every 6 months or so, right? There you go. So you take a risk, and you often just can't predict how people are going to respond, right? But so you have this really wonderful essay. I've had such a great day today rereading Becca's oeuvre. I highly suggest you just like Google her or go on her website and just start reading everything she's written. You have a great, you say a lot of great things about Sally Rooney that every one of which I agree with. But one of them is you compare Sally Rooney to Jane Austen. And what you say is that in Jane Austen, there is suspense. And you don't know whether everything is going to work out for everyone. That is, Jane Austen, unlike Rooney, is not like escapist. And that like, maybe you say, Rooney's books are riskless and conciliatory. In the fairy tale worlds they sketch, everybody who bothers to compete is already assured of winning.
I would never have the courage to say that to her face. That's why you got to write things down.
But what you're really saying there is like real writers take risks. Right. But now you want to say, yeah, but only in writing, not in speech. And so I want to know how do you pick which risks you want to take?
Because some risks are just foolhardy and some risks like are considered. So, I mean, I think that you want to be held responsible for a risk that you stand by and that you've like evinced like arguments and textual evidence for. Like, I feel like I've made arguments for that essay that I stand by and I've quoted the text and so on. Whereas in speech, you just say like, dumb, risky things sort of by mistake. And then you don't want to be like held to them.
Okay, so it's like you're taking a considered risk in writing.
An interesting risk. I think in writing, you can calculate like, is this risk interesting? Is this like an unpredictable but like cool thought that takes things forward? Whereas in speech, like what you're risking a lot of the time is just kind of like saying something boring because it's the first thing that comes to you.
So like the way that it seems to me is that conversation has this very sort of like this character where you're sort of guessing and making experimental attempts and seeing where it's going to go and often failing, right? So it's very messy and there's like a high failure rate. And the way to think about the risks is not to think about each individual like expression, but just to think about the process as a whole. But like, I guess your thought, now that I'm saying this out loud, I guess your thought is going to be, yeah, but you can like obviate all of those. You can make all those risks be way less by not doing it in public. And so you can have all those conversations with people individually, even though you still say you prefer writing even to those, right?
Yeah, when I have like a fight with like my partner, I'll like write him an email because I'm like, then I can be clear about like my problems.
Okay, so I happen to just have been rewatching Bergman's Scenes from a Marriage over the past week, and because I had your piece in mind, I was thinking, I wonder what it would be to have this as like an epistolary novel or something, right? Like, so it's like this series about this married couple whose marriage is sort of falling apart, does fall apart, kind of. But it's these really intense emotional conversations, like with the face close-ups. And I can't imagine it any way but talk. That is, I feel like it had to be talk, that there's a kind of visceral character to talk that writing can't capture.
I mean, I think that that's true. That's maybe true. I mean, I think that my writing is the most intimate thing about me. And so I said this to my editor when I was selling her my book and she was like horrified. I was like, the editor-writer relationship is like the most intimate relationship I can imagine. And she was like, what? Like, I don't really feel that way. And I was like, okay, well, I do. I feel like I put more of myself in conversation, maybe this is just a problem with me, but I feel that performance is inevitable and self-protection is inevitable. But when I get down to the business of writing, at least in my life, it's the sphere that I've carved out for absolute vulnerability and for building up the courage to say what it is that I actually think, even if I think it's going to be unpopular, like knowing full well what the consequences are going to be. Whereas in conversation, I'm like very self-protective most of the time, I think. So like I do find like a writing relationship like very intimate because it's a domain in which you've chosen to expose the softest parts of yourself. Whereas often in conversation, what you're doing is just posturing and messing around. That's not always true, but it's sometimes true. But you can also be vulnerable in conversation in private. It's sort of the public aspect. I suppose my essay should have been writers shouldn't talk in public. They could talk in private still.
I actually think that was implied. So
yeah.
Okay, I'm going to change topic here and kind of indulge myself in that I read one of your favorite pieces of mine is on one of my favorite filmmakers, Eric Rohmer. And so Becca has this great piece, which I recommend to you all, on Rohmer's movies and the kind of restrained sensuality in them. Like he just has all these movies in which people don't have sex, basically. And
but like almost have sex.
Yeah, but almost
like it's like 2 hours.
Incredibly erotic, right? So what you observe is like, so here's a quote from you. We live in a shameless society. If love requires scandal and nothing scandalizes us any longer, how is the novelist to cast lovers beyond the bounds of respectability, which is to say, how is the novelist to render lovers at all? And at some point later in the piece, you say, the more repressive and puritanical a culture, the more considerable its erotic potential. So I wonder just like, what do you think about our erotic potential as a culture? Like, is eroticism dead? Could you imagine a Rohmer movie being made today?
I think the first quote is Lionel Trilling on his essay on Lolita, which I quote. It might be me. I actually don't remember anymore, but I think it's Lionel Trilling because I think he's talking about how like Lolita is the way to write a romance novel because it's like the only thing that can scandalize us today.
I think you might be right. Sorry about that.
Anyway, I think that our culture is actually like enormously sanctimonious and moralizing and pious. And so it's like a great time to have weird sex. And it's better maybe now. Yeah.
Okay. So
I guess
we've improved in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, like in the 60s or like the 70s, I think everything goes, but now we've like reimposed restraints. It's a bit like Oulipo, like the writing movement where they reintroduced constraints. It's like, yeah.
I don't know about that.
It's this French literary movement where they would just sort of introduce like games that they would play. Like they would set rules for themselves and then write like entire novels on the basis of the rules. Like Georges Perec and Raymond Queneau are the pioneers of this movement. But in thinking about that, I was like, these people want to be bounded because they can find sort of a freedom in boundedness. I think similarly, like maybe the psychoanalytic explanation for the reintroduction of so much moralizing is that people want kinky sex to be kinky again. But that's the kind of thing that I like, you know, this is my fear. I've just said the bad thing. That will be quoted on Twitter and I'll be canceled.
Okay. I have like maybe just two more things I have to ask you. And then, so one of them is about, so you know, your kind of pet peeve is this kind of demand to talk and to present yourself in the less polished forum of speech. And mine is being told what to do. And I feel like writers, and so what I want you to know is tell me, like, is it just that I'm hypersensitive? Has this always been what's happening? Or is this like a new thing where I feel like writers are constantly telling me what to do? Like they're saying, we should do this and we shouldn't do this and we have to do this. You know, we shouldn't think about it this way. We should think about it this way. There's like so much direction being given in writing. There's so many commands. And somehow that really bugs me, even though obviously I don't have to do it, but I'm still bugged by it.
I mean, I guess I'm just not bugged by it because I think, well, I just don't have to do it and I can like push back against it. I mean, I guess I often try to read people sort of like performatively, like this person is making a rhetorical gesture in print and they might not fully stand by it. They might not actually think that this is the thing that you have to do, but they're like committing themselves for the bit. That's a charitable way to read that kind of stuff. But I mean, I guess people have always been sort of moralizing. That doesn't bother me so much because I'm a moral philosopher sometimes.
Oh, it's not the moral. Yeah, I guess it's a kind of moralizing. Like I like when people talk about morality,
Maybe it's the content often that annoys me. Like frequently I disagree with like what I'm being told to do, but
Right.
it's not that I'm being told to do it that bothers me. It's that I think they're wrong. That's not what I should do.
Right. Right. I at those moments very much feel my inability to talk back. I think that's what it is. It's like, well, I want to be able to argue back. You've said this thing, which is the sort of thing where I ought to be able to reply, but you knew I wouldn't be able to. So you knew you could just order me around with impunity. And that's what bugs me.
But that's like the joy of being a critic, is that when you feel real irritation with somebody's like arguments that you think are bad, you can write like a devastating piece about it.
Okay, so I have to ask you this too then. So like critics are, and you're no exception, notoriously crotchety. That, you know, you don't like how we have all this escapist literature and sanctimonious literature and how there's a politics of everything, and you don't like podcasts and Twitter. And so what do you think is going really well these days?
It's a good question. What's going well these days? Not so much. I mean, I think like nonfiction writing is like going pretty well. I mean, I'm obviously biased in favor of criticism because I write it, but I think there's lots of really good critics, and I'm like way more excited to read a lot of critics and like nonfiction writers. I mean, I am excited to read like a lot of fiction writers too, but I guess maybe there's more nonfiction writers right now that I'm like really excited about, like James Wood, Daniel Mendelsohn, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. So those are all people who like really excite me. I actually think people are very pessimistic about like little magazines. And like, of course, there's reason to be, because financing them is a challenge, and book forum just closed, which is like a huge travesty. Nonetheless, I think that there's actually like an explosion of interest, and there's like many interesting little magazines right now. So I think that's something to be optimistic about.
Okay, this is my last question. And then we're going to take a little break and then come back, and then you can ask us questions. So you and I are both fans of this essay by Heinrich von Kleist, the playwright, which is called On the Gradual Construction of Thoughts During Speech, I think.
Something like that.
And so what Kleist notices is that sometimes he's like thinking about a problem and he can't get anywhere. And then he just looks over at his sister, and just her face, like just seeing her face and the project of explaining it to her, the thoughts come out of him in words, and he's able to articulate himself, and he had the solution to the problem just flows out of his mouth. And, you know, he says sometimes like the idea comes in the speaking. So one thing he observes at the end of that essay, he says, but examinations don't work. Like, so suppose you like wanted to figure out what someone knew, right? You might try to get them to speak, right? Do an examination, like for a student, right? You might have like an oral exam or something. And he says, no, that's a terrible way. Like the person actually has to kind of speak of their own. You can't try to get it by examination. And so here's a quote from Kleist. It is difficult to play on a human mind and induce it to yield its peculiar sound. Clumsy hands so easily disturb its pitch that even the most experienced observer of men practiced in the art of mental midwifery, as Kant calls it. That's weird that he says Kant there, but okay, maybe Kant stole it from Socrates. Practiced in the art of mental midwifery, as Kant calls it, to a masterly degree, could go wrong in this case owing to the unfamiliarity with his patient. So what Kleist is saying is, if I try to examine you, I try to examine Becca, right? And I'm trying to extract her knowledge so that I can put it before you guys. I may be an expert in playing on her mind as an instrument, right? And so what we might get will be some terrible sounds that don't actually represent what she actually thinks. So I feel like the fundamental disagreement between us is, if we say the mind is an organ, right? Is the question, who is the best at playing it? Is it the person themselves, or is it other people? And like my view is other people are actually better at playing the organ of my mind than I am.
I don't disagree with that. I just think prefer the media. I mean, I think like all writing is responsive, and like criticism in particular wears its responsiveness on its sleeve because it's almost always responding to a particular text. It's kind of just like the way in which you choose to interface with other people. Because I know the best parts of myself, or so I believe anyway, are crystallized in writing. I want to encounter the best parts of other people. I feel like this is reinforced time and time again when I learn that some author who has achieved like remarkable feats of humanism and charity in their writing was like a horrible person in their life, like famously Tolstoy and David Foster Wallace, like both said all these sexist things, but like they have amazing portraits of women in their fiction. And so I feel like it's more charitable of me to believe the self that emerges in their writing. And that's what I hope like others would do to me. So it's not that I feel that I should be in dialogue with myself, but that I would rather be in dialogue with like the best pieces of other people. And I feel those are to be found in their writing, if they're writers.
Okay. Good note to pause on. So we're gonna like get up, walk around, get our circulation flowing because this room is hot. Feel free to leave or stay. We're just gonna take like a 10-minute break. And I think there are still some cookies for the first of you to get back there.
I want another cookie.
Okay, me too. If we get there. Yeah. Great. Bye. I mean, it's not gonna help because I'm just gonna have some more questions there. Okay. Whoa. Hey, everyone, we're gonna start up again. I suggest moving up towards the front. It'll feel more cozy for us. You can, if you want to ask a question, just come up to the front and you can, I guess, line up around that edge if people want to line up, or we can just wait and William is back there. Okay. So in a minute, there'll be somebody. Thank you. I appreciate this coming forward thing. It makes me feel more loved when people are closer to me. And oh, wow, we already got a line. Awesome. Okay. So after you ask your question, William, who's right here, will give you merchandise. Not merchandise, swag.
Can I get swag? Just
yes.
Okay.
Yes, you do. Just for answering questions. Okay, first question, please come. I think that might not be on.
Hello?
Yeah,
Oh, perfect.
it sounds
Okay.
on.
It's a little bit tall. First of all, thank you for being here today. My name is Annie, and so throughout like the last hour, I guess, you've been talking about how a motivation for writing is that you like, I guess, the ability to be super precise in representing your thoughts. So my question is, and I kind of stole this from a friend who's in a linguistics class, but so English, the language we use, is inherently pretty messy, sometimes ambiguous, vague. So I was wondering if you would like prefer English itself to maybe be a more precise language, let's say words only having one meaning. Like, would you prefer that? And what do you think we would lose out on, and what would we gain?
I mean, I think that, is this audible? I feel like I did a bad job of being audible last time. This is audible. This is not audible.
Less so.
Both audible. Okay. I mean, I think that literary stuff, like the literary quality or whatever, sort of relies on the ambiguities of language. So I think I ironically was being imprecise and saying that it's precision exactly that like I'm after in writing. Maybe a better thing to say would be eloquence, which isn't always exactly the same thing as precision. Sometimes it amounts to like a lyrical quality. But I think that first of all, I want the time to figure out what it is that I think, apart from how I want to express what it is that I think. And I don't feel like I have enough time to figure that out in conversation. And then second of all, I want to figure out the best way to express it, which I don't think always involves precision. It might involve like evocative language or something like that. But I think the task of writing is to figure out how to evoke or express or otherwise get at the thought that you've figured out that you have, which sometimes involves like playing on ambiguities and sometimes involves trying to get precise.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add something to that, which is that, like, as philosophers, we're often trying to be precise. And I, like in the class on Aristotle's physics that I taught yesterday, I used like symbols, right? So there are many contexts in which I find myself saying, okay, here's like a symbolic way of representing the ideas here, as a way of simplifying and as a way of adding a certain kind of precision, maybe other kinds of precision I'm not adding. So it's interesting to think about in what context do we want to introduce that, and then in what context do we actually want the ambiguity? I like English as it is because I want to be able to do both. But maybe, do you think it's right to say that the ambiguities are going to be important to us to the degree that there is some emotional component? That is emotion what makes the ambiguity relevant, or is there something else in addition to emotion? Emotion plus, I mean, I don't know whether aesthetic experience could, yeah, I guess the experience of beauty is an emotion, right? We can call it emotion.
Yeah, I think it's like emotion that makes the ambiguities important. Maybe it's also that the potential for sort of punning or for double entendres is what allows the audience to react in the way to your writing that you want them to. Like maybe what you're trying to do is elicit a particular kind of response in your audience. You're not trying to just implant a thought in them. Sometimes that's what you're trying to do. I should say that sometimes I also choose words not for their ambiguity or for their precision, but just for their sensible qualities. Like, I want this to be alliterative, or I think that this sentence sounds better with this many syllables or whatever. So it's having time to reflect, to construct a sentence as perfectly as possible, whatever that means for the sentence at issue. That is what's good about writing for me.
Thanks.
Cool, thank you.
Hi, my name is Bella. And the question I have for you is that you spoke about your fear in a way of being misinterpreted and judged for things that you say that then lead you to, and that fear then leads you to prefer writing because it allows you to express your opinions more precisely. Is there a risk in that fear will block certain ideas from being engaged with? Like, is fear a proper motivation for a writer? Or is it better for every idea that you think of that you find interesting to be discussed in some way and then simply admit the possibility that you might be wrong?
So I think fear is kind of inevitable. Fear of one thing or another is kind of inevitable in writers. I mean, I don't want to generalize and speak for other people, but at least for me, even prior to my fear of, I guess, cancellation and all kinds of like negative professional consequences, it's just my fear of misspeaking not adequately expressing in whatever way that is, maybe not with precision, but not adequately evocatively expressing, or not using the word that sounds the best, sometimes not being precise. This fear of misspeaking that drove me to write in the first place. And I think that that's like widely shared among writers. So I think that a commitment to expressing your ideas well, whatever that turns out to mean, is not the same as a commitment to suppressing ideas that might turn out to be unpopular. It's just a commitment to doing so in a way that allows the ideas to flourish and to be presented in their best light. So I think that if you're going to present what's sure to be an unpopular idea, it's better to do so by marshaling as much evidence as possible and making as many arguments as you can. I also find that I'm more courageous in writing than in speaking, because in speaking, my like instinct is self-protective, as I said, whereas in writing, I have time to sort of talk myself out of that instinct. I have time to say, like, why am I doing this? I'm doing this to say what I believe. Are people going to be mean on Twitter? Yes, they are. Like, should I care? No. Whereas in person, my desire is to get the person I'm talking to like lose the argument or like me. And those are like base cowardly desires. So I need like time to talk myself out of them, I guess.
I'm just surprised by that, like the self-description, because like right now in talking to me, it just seems to me you're extremely direct. And like, I mean, maybe you're like a master deceiver, but like you actually just seem to me to be saying the thing that you think and not being massively defensive. Like you're expressing worries and fears, but even that, it's actually not that it's not defensive to express them, right? In a way, it's undefensive to express them. So like I mean, maybe I don't think you're more defensive and self-protective than the average person in public conversation, but maybe that's still just very salient about you to yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's totally possible that I'm misdescribing myself and that like most people are misdescribing themselves most of the time. I think it depends like also highly on conversational context. Like this is a conversational context in which it's kind of like writing adjacent and it's like professional adjacent or something. And so I'm being better than I would be. But like if you were to ask my husband, for example, like debate mode is what he calls it. I was an avid debater in high school and I slip into debate mode very easily in like conversations with him or like at a party. Like if you say, you think communitarianism is right, like I'm not going to stop until I've convinced you like communitarianism is wrong. But that's not an impulse that I always admire in myself.
I think I admire that in myself. So I think it's like I'm happy with that. I'm the same. I was a debater. I do the exact same thing, but I like it. So maybe that's the difference. All right. Well, thank you. Thanks for the question.
Hi, I'm Kareen. I was wondering when you guys were talking about Franz Kafka and his diaries, what the kind of differences and similarities are between first drafts and speaking. Like, does writing inherently, like first drafts are kind of I like to call it brain vomit, kind of just like getting thoughts down on the page, a stream of consciousness style. Does writing though kind of inherently imply some kind of layer of reflection instead of speaking? Is there like a difference of intention in both of those? Does having people around you affect it somehow? Yeah.
I mean, I think it probably depends on how it is that you go about constructing a first draft, and I'm sure people do this differently. For me, the first draft is already the product of lots of organization of my thought. It's not really word vomit. So my process is like, I read everything the author's written that I'm reviewing, and like maybe some biographies of the author, whatever, like books about the author. I go through everything, type up all the quotes that I've underlined, like collate all my marginalia. Then I like reflect on it. I organize it into an outline. So by the time that I sit down and I start like actually doing the first draft, there's already a ton of mediation that isn't present in speech. So for me, no, but I think I suppose like a first draft that's unedited or like the beginning of the collation process is close
So my question is, going back to the writers talking, exposing their non-genius, sort of in your words, we tend to believe that our favorite authors don't just write aesthetically well, but also write with a sort of profundity that expresses, that suggests that they have some sort of unique genius insight into the working of our, workings of our world, and especially of our social system, especially in regards to views that sort of agree with our priors. Do you think that in a world where the expected role of the author and the artist in general is of social commentator and of activist, that we have sort of developed some sort of too high expectation of the arguments and beliefs that authors express and aren't just particular to the writing itself, whether those accusations be about the content of those beliefs or the accuracy?
I mean, I don't know that I think that there is a distinction or a dichotomy between the aesthetics of a piece of writing and its content. I think that those things are more closely related than most people think. And not to think that aesthetics is kind of just ornamental or is dressing on the salad is to underrate the importance of aesthetics. I think the way that you say something is deeply influential with respect to what it is that you're saying. So I suppose I sort of reject the premise of the question. Which is cool. I mean, I could be wrong, obviously.
I guess I didn't fully understand the question, but I heard something. I heard something. I thought that the question was asking after this, should we be associating writers with their beliefs? Were you asking about the relationship between style and content?
Associate the aesthetic expression of an author with beliefs that have some sort of like empirical is wrong, or sort of value in actually giving us insights into the wider non-aesthetic world.
I mean,
I see. And you were taking that as like the content.
yes, I guess I was taking that as, well, I was taking you to be presenting like a dichotomy between these things. And I was saying that I don't think that one of the reasons that I think that getting the words in which a thought is expressed right, getting the words right, getting the phrasing right is so important is because I don't think that there's like much of a gap between the form and the substance, or I don't think that's like neatly delineable. Is that responsive to your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I sorry, I'm just thinking about that. I guess it seems to me like you could express certain thoughts in a variety of ways. So can you just say another sentence about why do you reject the style content distinction?
I mean, I guess because I think that the content, at least of literary writing, and I don't think that this applies to philosophy, where what's at issue is sort of like proposition extraction, or at least that's true sometimes. But the content of literary writing, I mean, there's many contents it can have, but one of them is sort of its effect on the reader. And so I think that the effect that a piece of writing has on the reader is often the joint product of like what it means and its like sensible qualities. Particularly because a lot of criticism is like intended to be evocative, and so is supposed to help you understand the quality or the texture of the thing that's under criticism. I think like evocation is often indispensable.
Okay, that's super helpful actually, because I often have this experience when I'm reading, especially stuff that you write, like there'll be like a sentence or two that just have like a delicious nugget, and I want to like read it over. And like I was encountering a bunch of these sentences as I was reading it. I'm like, oh, that one. And so I think you're like, that is an effect of writing where you can give something to someone, there's like a particular sentence, a particular phrasing, and it kind of hits you, right? Speech doesn't, except if you're very witty, that just doesn't happen in speech. So that seems right. And so maybe to the extent that you're really interested in sort of that effect, right? That's just something speech can't do.
Yeah, I mean, maybe something I should have said is that I think in criticism in particular, it's important that you're addressing the things that you're writing about in the medium in which they are presented. So James Wood says this thing about how critics have a competitive proximity to what it is that they're reviewing, literary critics, because they're writing about writing. So unlike a music critic, you're not making music in response to music, you're engaging with it in the same medium. And so for that, it does seem important that it's in writing. That's like an argument I didn't make in the piece, but that's just occurring to me now.
Cool. Okay, thank you for the question.
Grace Trotter, in your opinion, what are the strengths and weaknesses of writing versus speech in terms of that's really well done. And just being blown away by feeling like an experience has really been described in a very real, organic way.
I have a lot of thoughts in response to this. I mean, I guess the first one is that if you're a critic who's writing about writing, then obviously you can achieve greater
raising questions, like by asking you questions, right? And so like books can raise questions, but people can raise questions, but maybe the thing about people is that they can be unpredictable, right? So like Socrates talking to some guy, Euthyphro, and Euthyphro's like, sorry, gotta go. And Socrates like, wait, we're still like, you know, in this. So there's an interesting way in which like a person has more opportunities to disappoint you, I think, in terms of their raising of questions. So even though people can directly raise questions, they often choose not to do so. Like sometimes you have to be like, you know, please come and ask us questions and we'll give you a tote bag and whatever, if you'll just give us some questions, right? So maybe there's a way in which written texts are kind of a reliable source of questions when people aren't always.
Hi, thank you for coming, talking with us. So my question was, a lot of the times when writers are talking in public, it's because we think they have something interesting to say, something insightful, or like they're aesthetically just really beautiful. And I was wondering,
Obviously, I'm in the really beautiful category.
And it feels like a lot of the times the questions center around like their methodologic, their writing process. And that one feels like something that might not need as much, like it's not a new idea. They can just kind of explain to a certain extent what their writing process is. And also something that could be really informative considering they have these ideas that we think are really important and influential. So I was wondering if you saw a value in writers talking about like their writing process and methodology publicly.
That's a good question.
I mean, I think that there's definitely, I mean, for accessibility reasons, like to help other people who want to know how to write or something, I think that there's value in it. I'm not sure that there's value in speaking it as opposed to writing it. So I'm not sure that there's like something more important about having an extemporaneous discussion with a writer explaining what their method is than there is in just reading a writer having written something down about what their method is. And I guess your question made me think about like why it is that writers actually do speak, in my opinion, and why it is that people go see them speak. And I feel like the actual answers are often kind of craven. Like writers speak because like their publishers kind of like make them speak. And people go see them speak because they're kind of just like curious, like seeing an animal at a zoo or something like that. But maybe I'm just really cynical.
I mean, so, you know, if we go back to like the careerism issue, right? Like, so your thought is that nowadays, a writer needs a brand and somehow their writing is not sufficient to produce that brand. And so they're supposed to make these appearances. So a physical appearance for one, people would want to know what you look like. I remember in the old days of WBEZ and the show This American Life, the Ira Glass who ran it used to insist on like not being photographed. And he would have like, there was like a thing where he had a photo like radio equals no pictures. And he put it in front of his face that radio equals no pictures. Like, you're not supposed to know what I look like. It's radio.
I respect that.
So you might think of the physical appearance as also being like this extraneous thing, like the fact that like you have some ideas and then you appear in a certain way, but that's not like connected up with the stuff you write, right? So I guess your objections, it seems to me you really have two independent objections to writers talking. Like one of them is a fear, the fear of repercussions being taken against you because of something you say without having much thought about it, and then it's getting sort of written in stone in the social media. So that's the fear thing. And then there's the careerism thing, which is really very different objection, right? Which is like, you don't want to be having to produce a persona of yourself in these contexts of like podcasts, et cetera. And so it may be that suppose you were to believe me that if I were to say, which I would say, you're actually extremely good at this, that is you're better than the average, you're better than the average writer. So you could get ahead even more by doing this, right? But then like, you still might have this careerism worry. I guess I want to hear a little bit more about this, about the careerism worry. Like, would you still have it if you thought that you were very good at this self-presentation? Do you somehow have a distaste about the very act of like selling yourself to an audience?
Yes, I think I maybe have like 4 objections, like if I were rewriting the essay or writing an expanded version that I would talk about. So like one is just that how it's part and parcel of this broader system in which writers are expected to, in which writers are only incidentally writers, and they're more quintessentially just like public figures in whom people can have relationships, like kind of glorified influencers. And I think that that's bad for people who get into writing, not because they want to be celebrities, which is certainly not my reason for getting into writing, but because they enjoy the act of writing in solitude, like the sort of carpentry of fiddling with sentences in their construction. And the more sort of extraneous engagements of various kinds that you have, the less just time that you have to sit by yourself and do writing. It like really encroaches on your time. And there's probably lots of like sort of other negative effects. So like, I guess that's the careerism objection. The second objection would just be maybe I think it's a worse medium in general, although there are probably some like geniuses at speaking. I do think that having time to reflect slowly and to reconsider your thoughts and to consult more sources is generally better for the quality of thoughts. The third is that like it's bad for writers because it has the potential to damage their career, but also because they might just fear misspeaking. Like I have this pathological fear of misspeaking that even predates my opportunistic fears of cancellation. It's just a fear of not expressing things the way that I, upon reflection, feel that they should be expressed. And then finally, the fear is sort of the effect on the audience, that the audience will be disappointed because they mistakenly believe there's some kind of correlation between being talented at writing and talented at speaking, and there is no such correlation. And because the audience may misinterpret what the writer says as expressive of their principled, considered beliefs, when in reality, the author's just popping off. So those are my 4.
Yeah, it's interesting because what happened here is that you produce something in writing, and now in speech, you've sort of corrected and produced the better version, which has this quadripartite distinction, right? Of like the 4 ways. And like,
I don't know, winning this conversation is losing, like not failing to fall to the floor and like have a panic attack is losing ultimately. So I guess I failed.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. I love Kafka, but I have sort of a tiny moral crisis whenever I read his work, because I know that he would not want me to read his work. And I feel like that moral crisis would very quickly become not tiny if I was reading his like literal diaries. And I was just wondering if you can conceive of something that Kafka could have written that you would feel morally not okay reading. Like I don't know, because I feel like that a lot. So that's my question.
I mean, that's a really good question. And I think the answer is probably more reflective of me than it is about anything else, which is just that my voyeuristic desire to penetrate to the core of Kafka like outweighs my scruples. So it's not really that I don't feel moral qualms or that I don't feel that I should, but that I just want to read more Kafka. And so I will. But I mean, I sympathize with him, because of course I have this enormous fear also that like my horrible like emails will be published or whatever.
I think it's interesting to, if you recall, like a bunch of years ago when the Knausgaard novels first came out, there was all this controversy because like his family members didn't want to be in the novel, and his novels are kind of, you know, about his life, and they're just directly naming people in his life. And I feel like a lot of people were like offended. There was a lot of upsetness, but still everybody read them. Right. So it's interesting that these moral compunctions about what kinds of stuff you're allowed to talk about and write don't ever seem to translate to the people actually not doing the reading of that person. That somehow the compellingness of like, but I want to know what it says is so powerful that yeah, I mean, to me, like, do you think that this would really hold you back, the diaries? Like, would you actually not read if you thought that they were really good? Like, there was really good stuff in there, because it's easy to be like, well, maybe there's not that much good stuff in there, but then you read Becca's like review, you're like, ooh, there's some interesting stuff in here. I want to see his drawings.
And the new edition of the diary.
Oh, okay.
Or like a few, but not all of them.
Okay. So do you actually think it would actually restrain you?
I don't know. I think maybe, I don't know, like there's like definitely certain things that like people have produced that I would feel uncomfortable consuming, right?
Mhm.
Like you wouldn't watch someone's like sex tape without their permission, right? So I feel like I wouldn't, there's like, I can conceive of things that people make that I wouldn't want to, like I would feel bad watching. But like, I don't know. I guess if they were really good, then I might be convinced to read the diary.
You might have like not a moral, but an aesthetic qualm, which is kind of what I have with like art forms, the construction of which I don't understand. Like it's relieving to me to listen to music, having no idea how it's constructed and no idea how I go about constructing it, because it's a soothing experience in a way that reading isn't for me, even though of course, like I like reading more than I like listening to music ultimately, but so you might have like an aesthetic reason to not want to pull the curtain back also.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hello, my name is Leo. Speaking of music, I play jazz, and I think
Cool.
one of the like by far the most compelling thing about improvised music is the kind of conversation you can have with your band members and with the audience, and you can kind of feed off each other. And so I just wanted to ask about potentially like the inherent values of conversation that you really can't get from writing, because I feel like there's kind of the human to human connection, and there's this sort of getting to know each other and telling stories that you might not otherwise kind of bring up, or just like the instant ability to be like, can you explain that more? Can you do this kind of thing? Like, what do you think about the potential kind of amazingness of conversation as opposed to writing?
So this is Socrates's opposition to writing as opposed to speaking in the Phaedrus. So you're in good company. I mean, I think it's not right to assume that a preference for writing is a preference for thinking in solitude. Like, I think that you can have conversations in writing. So as I said to Agnes at like the end of our talk, it isn't that I think of myself as thinking alone, in particular because I'm a critic. So most of the time I'm having like a very close conversation that's very intimately tethered to something someone else did. Like I have no pretensions to writing something sui generis the way that like I think idiotic novelists might, because everyone is in conversation with a tradition or should be. It's just that you're in conversation with a different part of somebody's output, or it's a different kind of conversation at a different pace. I think that's my response, is that I think the best response to writing is often writing. And so that's one reason to think that criticism in writing is a better response to writing than talking is.
You know, I reread the Phaedrus in preparation for this conversation, and also because I like the Phaedrus. And I came across a line. It's not speaking or writing well that's shameful. What's really shameful is to engage in either of them shamefully or badly. Now, that might sound like a truism. Obviously, obviously doing anything badly is bad, right? But it's actually, that line is a little bit surprising when you know what Socrates' view is about writing in the Phaedrus, which is to say he seems to be against writing, right? But he's not exactly against writing in the Phaedrus. When I reread it, you know, he has this weird view, which is that writing exists as a reminder. It reminds you of what you already knew. And it can't teach you new stuff. So, and there might be something to that in that it's like, if something is written down and then it comes into my head and now I just think it, that's sort of suspect. Like, I shouldn't just let the words like go from something outside me to me without like examining and interrogating them, right? But what if, like when I read the stuff you wrote about Sally Rooney, like, it's not that I had all those views thought through, but I just recognized it. It was like, yes, that like, if I had thought things through better, and if I could write as well as Becca, that's what I would have said. So there's a kind of, so you might think that there's a kind of a recognitional character. Writing serves as a reminder, at least some of the time. But speech, at least for Socrates, I think he thinks it's more generative. It's more able to get you to think something that you never thought before. I suspect you'll disagree with that.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't know why that would be true. Like, you can have somebody remind you of something in speech, and you can read something that presents like a new idea to you. I mean, I think it's just a mistake to think that the opposition is between like solitude and conversation. I think the opposition is just between two different media for conversation, or two different paces of conversation or something.
So I think the difference is that when you say, well, I'm in conversation with such and such a critic, right? What you really are in conversation with is like your mental avatar of that, or novelist or whatever, right? So you have a representation of them. Even like, say, Tolstoy, and say Tolstoy's women, right? So you have at any given moment like a representation in your head of like how Tolstoy presents Anna Karenina or something, right? And like there's a lot of you in every part of that story. And when you're in conversation with another person, there's just more otherness. Like, there's more of somebody being willing to just say no, that I think you're not really willing to say to yourself, even in the voice of someone that you're mentally conversing with.
I mean, first of all, I think that even in conversation, like, we're often having conversations with avatars or representations of other people that we construct. Like, I think that that's kind of unavoidable. But I suppose that I find, perhaps not because of anything intrinsic about reading, but just because of the role that it serves in my life, that I'm more willing to sublimate myself and allow the writer to infiltrate me or something like that when I'm reading, because the writer can't see me. There's no gaze directed at me, which means that there's nothing performative. I'm sitting on my sofa looking terrible, making no effort to seem smart. If I'm confused, I just allow myself to be confused because there's no audience. But I find that in conversation, like, my protectiveness comes in, and I try to present myself as if I know what I think, or as if I'm like a smart person. So I'm much more willing to be I'm much more willing to have my understanding of someone or something falsified by a text than I am by a person.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, thank you for being here. My question is, how do you reconcile the idea that writing is the most open and vulnerable expression of yourself while also being the most polished and curated? It seems to me like those ideas are kind of at odds.
That's a good question. I haven't thought that much about this before, so this is off the cusp. I guess I think that vulnerability often entails having the courage to reflect on what it is you believe and honestly express it. And I think that often in conversation, you're vulnerable in the sense that you're often saying foolish things, you're saying them inarticulately, but you're not vulnerable in the sense that I think that you're often engaging in lots of performances that are self-protective in nature, or at least that's what I find myself doing, at least in like public conversations, maybe not in some kind of like more intimate, not in like therapy, but maybe in therapy too. So I suppose I think that like vulnerability is the product of effort and like construction. Like it's frightening, and so it takes like time to talk yourself into a place where you can do it.
That makes a lot of sense to me. Like that, in effect, if you think that in writing you are, in speaking, you're often saying stuff that doesn't represent who you really are, like just saying something that occurred to you. But in writing, you really are presenting yourself in a more focused and kind of reliable way, then in a way you're more vulnerable in writing, because it's really you that's on the line as opposed to some outer images of you or something like that.
Yeah, like conversation for me often takes the form of like role playing, playing devil's advocate, finding myself defending a position just for the fun of it or because I don't want to lose face. Whereas that never happens to me in writing because I know that the stakes are higher, that people are going to interpret it as what I mean. And so I take the time to figure out what it is that I mean.
Thanks.
Hi, my name's Chirag. My question was like kind of based on the fact that I feel like a lot of this conversation was framed around like the writer and like their like protecting their interests versus like the interests of the readers like indulgence. And so I guess like one thing I was kind of wondering is like how you'd weigh kind of like the writer's interest over the readers and like why you'd weigh like the reader's interest to be like say like less important in terms like or like why the reader shouldn't indulge or if there was a time when the reader should indulge or also like thinking about like who the reader is because in some cases like the first like one case I can think of and I guess I don't know if this totally applies but like it's like office hours like when my like in a couple of classes that I've taken like the professor has like written or contributed to the textbook so I'll go to office hours because I can get a better understanding of what they were trying to say by talking to them. So like how do you kind of weigh like whether the reader should indulge in like this kind of thing especially because like especially like reading like a diary like why should the reader do it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I guess I think that the reader might have competing interests. I mean, they might have an interest in understanding how the author's self-presentation diverges from the author's reality. They might have this voyeuristic or sadistic interest that we've talked about in sort of catching the writer in their worst moment or in their most embarrassing posture. But alternatively, if they have an interest in encountering the best version of an idea, or as with me and music, what they desire out of the art form is to sort of just be wowed by the magic of it without having any idea how it was constructed, then it might be in their interest to sort of avoid talking to the writer in person. I mean, I basically found that almost all the time this is not less true of nonfiction writers, I guess. Maybe there's a greater correlation between being non-disappointing in person and writing good nonfiction. But almost every time that I've met a novelist whose novels I like, okay, I'm not going to go that far, but sometimes when I've met a novelist whose novels I like, I find them really disappointing in person. There's a line in Madame Bovary, it's like, never touch your idols, the gilding will stick to your fingers. And so I've thought of that like many times when I've seen like a writer I like talk and been like, oof. So sometimes I feel like it's in my interest to not know.
I think I often like want to talk to people. Like I want to talk to Becca about this piece because I wanted the version of it that was like designed for me. And like often when I ask someone a question, what I'm doing is like, so the idea you just gave, I want like the specially curated version for me that's going to fit to exactly what I want to know and exactly my idiosyncratic ways of knowing, right? And I want personalized. Like you wrote this thing for everybody, but I want the personalized version of it for me. It may be that the personalized version is less impressive, less polished, whatever, but there's a value to me in that because I can often process that version of it better than I can the more armored version of it. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Theo. Thank you for being here. I guess my question was already almost a little bit answered by Trug's question and the response to it, but I guess I was wondering, I know we've talked about your objection based on brands and it's unhealthy for writers to build their brands. And I wonder if it's healthy for readers and to go on book tours and things like this. And I wonder if it's healthy for readers to have writers build brands and go on book tours, not because they'll get a better or more accurate impression of the writer, because I don't know if it's necessarily healthy for readers to have a particularly exalted impression of any writer that they're reading. But it seems to me that it's good for readers to have a sort of what we were talking about, like mental avatars, to have a mental avatar of many different authors, which is full of information about that author and things that author has written and sort of brilliant nuggets that the author has said. Or has written rather. And it seems to me that it's easier to maintain those kinds of mental avatars for many people, including for me, if you've sort of seen the author, if you've heard their voice, if you have a sort of personal experience of them. I mean, like a couple months ago, I coincidentally and very briefly met the New Yorker writer Rachel Aviv, and she didn't say anything in person that I remembered particularly well, but I feel like now versus before, my mental avatar of her is likely to be fuller of things that she believes and interesting things that she said, just because I can say like, oh, I've talked to her and I have this sort of, I have the avatar is stronger because I know what she sounds like and what she's like in person.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm a strong believer in constructing mental avatars of writers, and I, as a writer, I'm a strong believer in colluding with the reader's construction of a mental avatar of me. I think that it's just a question of what the source of the mental avatar is. So I've sort of been thinking about this idea of like the critic as a character. Like, I think it's important for the critic to have like a distinctive sensibility and for sort of to be like a character who is recognized, much like Pessoa's heteronyms, as I said earlier. So it's not that I'm opposed to the construction of writerly avatars so much as that I think that you as the artist creating your avatar should have some control over the medium. And I think that often the construction of the writer in print makes for a better artwork.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense to me because I both very much enjoy, public presentation, sort of thoughtless, heedless public presentation of myself on the one hand, and I'm not as interested in constructing myself as a character. Maybe I do it, but I certainly don't do it very consciously. And maybe in a way it becomes hard to construct yourself as a character when you're just visible in all these contexts and you're just like putting stuff on Twitter that's like the first thing in your head and not thinking about it at all. That's just not going to be very artful, right? It's just going to be like if you took random shots of someone, photographs, versus if like the royal family when they pose for photos or something, it's very different from like candids. So it actually makes sense to me that not wanting to do talking would be correlated with actually wanting to have this persona. And so it maybe yes, like, with Rachel Levine, like with meeting someone or seeing them allows you to glom some things together, but still the restraint is actually important.
Yeah, the model for me is drag queens. So drag queens are like doing a live performance, so they're speaking. My dissertation is like nominally about what it is to be a beautiful person. I say nominally because I've written like almost none of it. I hope my advisors are not listening to this, but I will write it and it's going to be great. But so the model for me of like maximally beautiful people or people who are succeeding at being beautiful in the way that I think a person is beautiful is like drag queens, because they're engaged in this like incredible, very intentional, thoughtful, thorough aestheticization of themselves. So I think it can be done like via like literal in-person performance. And of course, part of what they're doing is talking. But I think that some people are not skilled at constructing themselves in that way. And so like my medium is writing.
Thanks, yeah.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Hi. So one of the assumptions that I've kind of noticed throughout this conversation is that the biggest argument against like speaking as like a mode of distributing ideas is that it's like not it's less good art, I guess. And so speaking goes down in importance for transmitting ideas, and I guess that puts the lowest form of intellectual transmission as podcasts. But the reality is that people do seem to really like podcasts, and for a lot of people who aren't, yeah, well, not everyone is an academic, and
that's the problem with society.
Yeah, well, so given that not everybody is an academic and plenty of people are willing to just use otherwise dead time to use the lossy transmission medium of podcasts to get the author's thesis, some big defending points, and I guess some intellectual pushback without actually reading the book as like a measure of practicality, that seems to work for a lot of people, and it's a thing that a lot of people want. So if you don't think that speaking is like the desired mode in which to do that, then what do you think fills that role instead?
That's a good question of a lot of components. I mean, I guess part of what I think is this is not a rule for everybody. It's just an expression of my personal aversion, which I think probably generalizes to other writers, but maybe not to everybody. For example, drag queens. So I think some people are probably really well suited to aestheticizing themselves and to making the best possible artworks of themselves in speech. And maybe that includes podcasters. But I think a lot of writers, not all writers, but I think that there's no necessary connection between being a talented writer and being a talented speaker. Sometimes there's accidental connections, and someone who's a great rhetorician is also a great writer, but like often that's not the case. So I think that writers in particular should not be expected or called upon to aestheticize themselves in that medium. But I don't think that that means that nobody should, because they're like vocal artists and orators and drag queens and other people who are good at talking. As for the question of like how to distribute ideas, I mean, I guess different people imbibe ideas differently. So like a correlate of my sort of distaste for talking is I actually really don't like listening to people talking. That's not how I like imbibe information either. So like when I'm listening to like a lecture, like I have to take notes and sort of in order to internalize what's being said. I much prefer reading a book. I've never listened to an audiobook in my life because I just can't do it. Like I need to reread sentences over and over again to feel like I've thoroughly suffused myself in them or something like that. So I think public intellectualism of like all forms is probably good at like filling in the gap. I don't think everybody should be an academic. That's a joke. I think academics are really bad at writing, often really bad at talking. Like actually nobody should be an academic. All academics should be public intellectual. But I think that public intellectualism can take like many forms. And so like the point, obviously I'm biased, but I think the point is a good way of doing that in writing.
So speaking as somebody who has a podcast and as an academic,
good writer.
But like, let me speak to your question as a podcaster. I've never said that. I've never applied that term to myself before. I'm kind of proud to call myself a podcaster. So I've been on many podcasts, and most of the ones I've been on are like what you described, which is like they have a different guest every time. And then that guest says like, I wrote this book and here's what it's about. And they get to be asked questions about it. I'm sure that has value. I don't listen to such podcasts. Actually, I don't listen to any podcasts. I'm the same as Becca. I don't like listening to stuff except if the person is alive and in front of me. I will read transcriptions of podcasts, and my podcast has transcriptions for every episode to accommodate those people who like to not listen to stuff. I also think so. My podcast is with Robin Hanson, who's coming to do Night Owls, and our podcast is just us talking about like a lot of different topics, and by like basically every topic you can imagine. Sorry, not every topic. I just mean there's as much variance between the topics as you can imagine. So it's an experiment. Because we don't agree with each other on anything, and we have totally different training, and we have totally different methodological approaches and completely different sets of assumptions. We just disagree about everything. And we're like, what would happen if we just kept talking to each other? Like, would we eventually come to agree on anything? We don't even agree about whether we disagree about stuff, by the way. He thinks we disagree a lot less than I do. But I think it's a really interesting experimental medium for trying to figure that out, of like, we now have this record, of like, I don't know, maybe we've done it for like a year and a half or something, and our conversations are changing. And we are like there's a kind of movement of thought that's perceptible in these in the differences of the conversation over time. And the fact that people are listening to us, not a lot of people, very few people listen to our podcast, I think, but some people listen, and that's sort of good enough because it makes us feel like we're, there's some reason to do it, but actually we're just talking to each other. I mean, that's it. It's just conversations between the two of us. I sort of feel like there's space for more stuff like that. That is, there's space in the world of podcasting for a lot of experimentation in respect of human communication. And the model of someone comes and explains what was in the book that they just wrote was like our first step. But like lots more steps exist that could be taken.
Maybe like the worst thing for a podcast to be is just something that aspires to summarize a piece of writing, which generally will be a better summary of itself than any summary on a podcast could be. But maybe like a podcast is just uniquely suited to something else, which is mirroring live human conversation. And that's also something that's valuable.
I have to say that I think our least popular podcasts are the ones where we happen to read some like philosophy article or whatever, and we're like, let's just discuss it. And like, no one in the audience has read it. So it's just completely, and we don't really summarize it that much. because we're actually talking about it. Anyway, those are our, we had some failures. But yeah, the just summary, I tend to agree, but maybe some people really like stuff being summarized. Thanks.
All right.
The original Point podcast was called Rather Be Reading. It's good. It no longer exists.
Hello. I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you for coming here.
Thank you.
But so my question is more zoomed in. And when you go to speaking engagements of writers, most of it, if not all, involves asking the author questions in order to get advice on what the questioner should do, how to get to where the author was. And in fact, I kind of did a similar thing when I showed up to Professor Callard's office hours, and I'm like, the job market with like humanities is not at the best level. Do you think I should become a tenure track professor? Like, should I go through a PhD? And of course, she was like, that's a loaded question. And I think Professor Callard talked about this in her column in the Point magazine, actually, on her article Against Advice, in which she said that advice is like aims to is an instrument for self-transformation, where it's like kind of like when Niles Crane criticizes his brother for dispensing advice in an entertaining and like a funny way with a very minute time spent with patients, and in the TV show Frasier. So I was wondering, to what extent is your criticism levied against speaking directed towards advice giving and that dispensing with advice that in many times is ineffective and does not actually help the person who asks the question or seeks the advice?
So, I mean, I think that maybe what people are seeking sometimes is information rather than advice, and information that they can use as inputs into decisions. And so I don't think that there's anything necessary about speaking as opposed to speaking about information or transmitting information via speech as opposed to via writing. But I do think that for contingent, non-necessary reasons, there's not a lot of transparency in our society about how people would do something like apply to graduate school or pursue a career in writing. So I think it's desirable that there be more transparency about those things. And so I think that it's good that people ask in whatever forum they feel comfortable asking in for, if not advice, if not what they should do in particular, which is probably impossible to say with the information that an author has at like a reading or something. But for information, I think it's good for them to get information, like however they get it. But maybe it would be, I mean, it certainly would be preferable if such information were generally publicly available and weren't so much like the product of knowing the right people and such. So I think that that's like an accidental feature of a flawed society.
Yeah, that seems right to me. I think you're really right that in a lot of these sorts of contexts, people get asked for advice, and they get asked much more in these in-person contexts than they would in like, just getting I don't know, I suppose writers get emails, how do I be like you or something, but like you're kind of asking for it if you do certain sorts of events. And I think that some of that is like, there's something ritualistic about the advice exchange. So it's like, if you ask me for advice and I give you some advice, maybe we both know that like, this isn't necessarily good advice and you're not going to take it, but we feel like we've had a connection because I've given you something personalized, right? And so I think a lot of the times people want that, they want to go through that ritual because it gives them a feeling of connection. I just think there are better rituals to go through, like ones where you actually get like the version of that person's ideas that are personalized for you. So now you can remember them and understand them and fit them into your cognitive framework better. But I think I'm hypersensitive to anything that I experience as pushy. And I experience even when advice is asked for by the person, I still experience it as pushy. Like as though, like if I would give you advice, like I feel like I'm pushing you around, and I'm very averse to that.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Elaine. Just wanted to say thank you so much for hosting this. It's really awesome. I know we've been talking a little bit about how you guys hate podcasts, but I kind of want to play the devil's advocate here and ask you like what kind of benefits and advantages that speech has over writing.
I mean, I guess that's like person specific. I mean, I think that there are people who are incredible at speaking. I keep returning to the example of drag queens. I mean, drag queens are performers, and so speech is only one component of their performance. But I think like lots of sort of theatrical events require that people speak. It's more that I think that I'm bad at speaking, and I resent the expectation that because maybe I'm good at writing, so I aspire to be, and some people believe that I am enough to publish me or whatever. The expectation that because I'm competent enough at writing, I'll be competent enough at speaking seems to me to be a misguided expectation. So I resent it, but I wouldn't choose speaking for the expression of lots of ideas for like the reasons that I've articulated, but I can understand why somebody more talented at speaking, for example, like rehearsed speech, like drag queens, for example, they might not rehearse everything that they say exactly, but they at least have a lot of practice sort of acting in persona. And so I think probably for them or for any other like seasoned performer who does a lot of improvisation, it's easier to speak on the fly and yet fold that into your self-aestheticization. But I think that as a writer, there's no reason to expect a person would be in the practice of that or especially adept at it.
So the way that I think about it is like, I think writing is sort of ideal for expression. Like if what you wanted was to like get an idea out there, the written version of it is going to tend to be the best version of it. But I think the thing that speech is that like talking back and forth is good for is like a certain kind of guidance in thought, right? So imagine you wanted to teach someone how to ride a bike. I mean, one thing you could do is like make a speech, a really perfect speech about how to ride a bike and like say that speech to them. And probably the speech that you give them, like if you get to like write it and you get to like perfect it, right? You could make it really good. But imagine like the difference between like getting them on the bike and being like, and you hold it a little bit for them at some point and like you let them go, and like that interaction, that to me is what talking feels like. Talking feels like somebody helping me think and like correcting me immediately. Like when I screw up, like often when I'm reading something and I screw up how I interpret it, I keep screwing it up for like a day until I can get clarity or like talk to someone else about it. This happened with Aristotle yesterday. I was like screwing up how I was interpreting a sentence of it. And I actually like texted my husband before my class and like all caps, Aristotle emergency. And because I needed him to like help me with this sentence that I just wasn't getting. And he could like correct me like really quickly, actually. And so it feels to me like speech is more a way to get a certain kind of guidance, a certain kind of very, very adaptive and responsive guidance in your thought.
I mean, I think that there's also like two questions, one of which is the first personal question of should I participate in speech for various reasons? Will it be beneficial for me? Will it be enjoyable for me? And then there's the third personal question of like, should I be listening to, or maybe second personal sometimes, should I be listening to other people like engaging in speech? And I feel like those questions may have very different answers at different stages. Like I do think that first personally, I learn a lot from engaging in private speech that I then in turn like translate into good writing. But I often think that people who third personally want to listen to me speak, like what are they doing? Like I do a much better job in my writing. Why wouldn't they just like read it?
Sorry, and then like, so would you speak more if you were better at speaking than writing then? Because it seems like it's a matter of like personal preference. So I just.
Maybe. I mean, I think it also depends on what your goals are. So I think that if your goal, I can't off the top of my head think of that many goals that I think speech is better suited to, which like says a lot about the goals that I have. I think that the goals that I have are such that writing is generally better suited to them. And that's sort of why I've honed my writing abilities as opposed to my speaking abilities. But I think that if I had different goals and different talents, I would sometimes speak. And there's certainly things that speaking is good for. It's just not the stuff that I care about that much.
I think that like, maybe I'm like close to the opposite, and that I think mostly I prefer speaking, but writing allows you to speak to a lot of people, many of whom haven't been born yet. And it's just very hard to do that any other way. So that's for me the power of writing.
Thank you.
Hi. Thank you for doing this. It was really fascinating. You guys talk and basically play two sides of a coin. And my question might be a bit of left field compared to all the previous ones, but given that this rise in social media and how like your speech can actually be documented, like how you mentioned you made that comment on Twitter and it went wild because it was still there and permanent, kind of in the sense that when you write something, even though you've had all that prep time, it is still permanent and you can't change it anymore. Do you think that due to the rise in social media and it becoming prominent in like our society now, and like even like marketing uses it as probably a course to talk about, hey, you need to learn how to talk on social media. Do you think the act of like speaking and the prep time used for that and the prep time essentially used for writing is starting to become blurred because of the fact that both can now be documented and like tracked again?
I mean, I certainly think so. I mean, my fear, I suppose I sort of accept that at some point, at many points, and in fact, it's already happened, people on the internet are going to get really mad at me for something. And I think probably unless you're really boring, that's going to happen to you at some point. But when that happens, I want to be prepared. I want them to get mad at me for something that I actually believe and I'm willing to defend and think that there's good arguments for. And so what I'm afraid of is that there will be documentation of me saying something that I don't really believe and there actually aren't good arguments for, and then I'll be like called upon to defend it. So another thing that could change that would make me more amenable to speaking is if we lived in a society that understood speaking differently or were more forgiving of gaffes in speech or allowed people to say, hey, I said that, but I actually don't mean that. I've totally changed my mind. But I think we live in a pretty unforgiving society.
It's worth noting in terms of my fearlessness and Becca's fearfulness that we're in very different positions, right? Becca is a graduate student. I'm a tenured professor, which means like however mad people get at me on social media, the risks to me are relatively low. So, you know, that's going to be a part of the explanation here, right? Of why different amounts of caution are appropriate.
Definitely, strongly agree.
Yeah. But I guess I think that it also, maybe the distinction like speech versus writing doesn't quite get at the thing that you're after. Because one of the things I was thinking about was like phone versus texting. Like I'm watching Scenes from Marriage and they're always like talking on the phone and they're like, these phones start ringing. I'm like, I jump because like, wait, what is that? Oh, it's the phone, you know, it's like this dial thing and it like it's attached to the wall and it can just ring anytime. And I always have my phone on silent, so it never like rings. And so there was like a time when people would like talk all the time on phones. And now people text, right? Which is like writing, but it doesn't really feel like texting is writing as you're understanding it, because you're understanding writing as like this thing where thought goes into it. And so some forms of writing might actually be more speech-like as far as you're understanding speech. And so we do a lot of writing. We write things on Twitter, we write things in texts, but that's a kind of though those things can get preserved and thus get us in trouble, they don't they don't have behind them the thoughtfulness of the kind of writing you're referring to.
I think that's right. But at least you have the option. Like you could take a lot of time drafting your tweet, like perfecting it into an art object. But in a conversation, if you're like, let me just think about that for like 30 minutes until I get my response perfectly right, that you can't really do that.
Yeah,
you could do that.
I'd say like, so like I was like in a text conversation with someone and like she said something witty and I'm like, okay, I always want to have like a witty repost. What I mean is I've always dreamed that one day I would have one. And I was like, oh, good. I'm not going to respond to this text until I come up with a witty repost. This is going to be my chance because sometimes it happens to me that I think of a witty repost that I should have said in a conversation, but like one day later when I can't use it. And I'm like, because this is on text, I'm going to be able to do this. And I waited for like a day for the witty repost to come to me and it just nothing. I thought of nothing. So I didn't just had to say a non-witty thing that was lame. And like, I think it was like I bet you I would have thought of one if I couldn't have used it. Anyway, that's not relevant to anything.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi.
So I was thinking about what you described as the collective voyeuristic impulse in reading Kafka's diaries, or what Becca described of meeting novelists whose work you admired previously and then being disappointed by them. And my question is the artist of the is the genius of the artist or novelist only retained if they're this recluse in solitude, or if they are able to somehow retain their elusive mysteriousness? And are there any great modern writers who defy this? And also, just a side question is, you mentioned that there are a few fiction writers whose work you're excited to read. So I was curious about those.
Yes, I was thinking about how, I always think that, I guess actually what happens is I've actually met a lot of novelists who haven't disappointed me, but I've disappointed myself in meeting them, because I kind of want to pay appropriate homage to them, and I want to touch their flesh with my flesh, and what that would involve would be writing an essay about them. So like that is kind of the only way that I feel, both because it's socially inappropriate and because I can't summon the resources on the spot. So I recently met Garth Greenwell, who's a novelist who I think is great. And he was not disappointing at all. He was like totally lovely in person, but I was not able, for lots of reasons, to sort of effuse about how great his novels were, because that would have just been weird and socially inappropriate to like monologue at him, be like, here's my interpretation of like your novels and here's what's so good about them. And so it's actually a sense of like frustration at my inability to achieve an in-person intimacy with someone that I feel I've already achieved with them on the page, or something like that, which maybe I will ultimately achieve with Garth Greenwell if we become like really good friends or something. I don't know. Yeah, but so he's one. Another person is Sheila Heti. I haven't met her, so I don't know. She would disappoint me. She seems cool.
It's funny. I have like the flip side of that, which is like, I remember like a couple of years ago, my oldest son was like complaining about he doesn't like that I put stuff on Twitter and that I'm like public. And he's like, don't you need a mystique? Like, don't your students want to like see you as having like a mystique, like this mysterious professor? We don't know what she thinks about stuff. We don't know what her life is like. And like that's how they're going to like respect you, is because you have this kind of like aura of unknowability. And I think I positively don't want that. Like, I think I have a positive desire not to have a mystique, which is very easy for me to achieve in everyday life because I'm a very unmystique-y kind of person. In that I tend to just say what I think all the time, but I want to continue that lack of a mystique in the public sphere. I just kind of want to, and I think it's probably not totally possible, but it's like, I just kind of want to be transparent. Like, to me, that's very attractive, even if it means I'm less like, I lose certain possible charms that I could have by having mystique.
Yeah, it's not like a person's genius that I feel that I want to protect, or like my own sense of I don't have a sense of my own genius, so I don't want to protect that. It's more that I'm just really invested in self-stylization. And I think that part of respecting someone in their capacity as an artist is respecting their self-stylization. And so what that might mean is sort of allowing them to self-stylize in the realm in which they're comfortable self-stylizing. And there are people who are sort of geniuses at organizing their life, like Odette in Swan's Way, which is the first book of whatever. She like has all these flowers in her house, and it's like amazing to read about her. And I wish I were like that, but I'm really not. Like, I'm really messy, and I'm like not that fashionable. So like, if I have more of a talent for like personal dramatization, that would be great, but I don't. So the realm in which like I self-stylize is like on the page, I guess. And I think maybe other writers feel that way.
Thanks.
Hello, thank you so much for doing this. I was really curious about your thoughts on kind of changing your mind about what you've written. So let's say that you write something and then years down the line, you change your mind. How do you feel about kind of retracting what you wrote or changing that? And how does that differ from retracting a position in speech?
So, I think that has not yet really happened to me. Possibly just because like I suck and I'm like really confident in all my judgments. Possibly because I'm not just like making judgments, I'm like making lots of like detailed and elaborate arguments for judgments. So I think that that's one advantage that writing has over speaking, is that in speaking, sometimes you just throw out a conclusion, but in like a long essay, that's not an option. At least if the essay is good, you're making arguments for the conclusion. So even if you later come to disagree with the conclusion on the basis of different arguments, at least your initial argumentation is crystallized somewhere. And so you can see why you were thinking what you were. And if you did a good job, you'll at least see the persuasive force of the arguments that you originally marshaled. So I think the difference is that you have to sort of undo the arguments or argue against yourself if you're going to retract something in writing that you wrote. Whereas in speech, you might just say, oh, I just wasn't thinking. I was kind of just throwing that out there as like a provocation. I didn't really have like a justification for it.
So, like, here's two things that have happened to me. One of them is like, so I wrote something for The Point called Parenting and Panic, and it was about parenting, but I very much felt like it didn't fully say the thing I wanted to say. But it wasn't that I thought it was wrong. It was just like, it was like gesturing at an idea. And then like I wrote another thing about parenting later that like developed the idea, but I almost feel like I needed that first foothold of like the incomplete version of the thought. And the second one isn't still not complete. But that happens to me actually a fair amount, that like I actually need to correct myself in writing in order to get to the second thing. But the other thing is more like, I've written some stuff on anger that I'm not sure that it's consistent, but I'm not sure that it's inconsistent actually. Like certain aspects of a phenomenon will present themselves very compellingly to me. And then later another facet of it will present itself very compellingly to me. And I often am not totally sure whether the two things are consistent or not. I'm like a little bit, if I had to go one way or the other based like about like this published paper that I have in like a collected volume academic paper, and then this thing I wrote in Boston Review on anger, like I lean towards not consistent. I would say I lean towards that, but even that I'm not sure about. I might change my mind about that, about whether or not they're consistent. So often I find it actually pretty hard to determine whether something I wrote is consistent with something else that I wrote.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you for doing this. And thank you also to everybody else who's making this happen. So something I've been thinking a lot about during my time here at UChicago is like this tradition of like intellectual rigor and just generally like a high standard for education that kind of like gives this school a lot of legitimacy to people. And so I guess my question is like, do you think that professors at UChicago are as good at teaching or better at teaching than they are at writing?
I feel like Agnes is much better qualified to answer this question than I am.
Okay, so that's a hard question to answer actually, because though I have read like some of what people here have written some of the time, and I have attended some classes, I haven't tried to coordinate those activities. So it's like, I haven't systematically tried to like do, compare. I think, I guess I think that here's one thing I can say. The performance of having a commitment to teaching happens among faculty at every level of administrative conversation. So what I mean is, there isn't a thing that's happening where in some context, faculty members are talking behind your backs and saying, actually, we don't care about teaching. Like, I've never heard anyone say that here. I've never heard any, and I've heard lots of people talk about teaching in lots and lots of different contexts. So there's at the very least a kind of overt like commitment to that. But that's not a comparison with writing. I kind of agree with Becca that like a lot of academic writing at the very least is quite painful to read, even for people in the very subfield.
At the very least.
Yeah, it's very least, I mean, some painful things might be good for you, but it is painful. And the other thing is that it is often it feels almost deliberately impenetrable to anyone who's on the outside of a particular subfield. Certain disciplines are less like this than others. Like psychology is not like this at all. It's so penetrable. It's really easy to read psychology, like research and stuff. But many areas are. Do you want to call that bad writing? Yeah, I kind of think it is bad writing, but but then it's like, and I think those very same people would be more intelligible speaking in front of a classroom. But that's partly that like the writing is actually pitched at a different group of people who are actually going to understand, even though they're pained by that those sorts of formulations. So it's actually hard to say that it's worse overall.
I think the structure of the academy, maybe not U Chicago in particular, certainly encourages people to prioritize research over teaching.
Yes.
And I think that that is very bad and is one of the things that I like least about academia, particularly because I think that Agnes is completely correct. I think that like people are way more likely to discuss the stakes of the issues that they're delving into and to return to their original reasons for being attracted to a discipline in the classroom than in their academic writing. So I think maybe among academics, I prefer speech to writing.
It's a bad sign about academics.
Can I just quickly ask a follow-up to that? Absolutely. Like, so I guess I'm also wondering, like, is there any way for professors to like know exactly how they, like other professors are teaching? Like,
Yeah.
is there any way
on their classes? I do it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Hello.
Hi, Rachel.
This is a question from the chat of the live stream. Unfortunately, the transcript of the chat got erased, which I think it's actually a mark against writing because it fools you into thinking that things are permanent and they're not always. So I'm just going to try to do this from memory. The question was originally directed at you, Becca, but perhaps both of you could answer it. It's from Emma, and she asked, what are the cardinal sins of criticism?
I mean, I suppose I don't totally know what that means. Like, is criticism intrinsically sinful? Like that could be the question, or like, what are just some bad ways to be a critic? I mean, I think it's bad to read people uncharitably. That's a bad way to be a critic. I'm not sure that criticism is intrinsically sinful. I think I would have to hear a little bit more about the question in order to answer it, which is a mark in favor of speaking, because I could ask for clarification where
No, she's not here.
Yeah.
She's back in the computer.
Sorry, Emma, you should email me. My email is Nabokov@gmail.com.
Can I kind of flesh the question out in one direction? A lot of times writers seem to hate critics, like novelists, and at least they put on the front of it. Like that piece you sent me on Philip Roth, like he secretly read all his critics and actually responded to them, but overtly it was like, oh, they're terrible. So why do writers hate critics?
I mean, I keep quoting this. I think I've quoted it like 3 times in the past 2 days, and I guess only in conversation am I realizing how important a line this is to me. But I love this James Wood line about how critics stand in a competitive proximity to writers. Because you're writing in the same medium, it's kind of a competition between you. And I think in the piece about James Wood, in which I quote this line, I say that I think James Wood sort of wins the competition a lot, or at least he's like a contender. Like even when he's writing about like Flaubert, I'm like, damn, James Wood is really good. So that, I mean, that could be one reason is that you're sort of vying in the same medium. And so there's a closer competition between you.
That's a great answer. Yeah. Because like when I'm reading you on Sally Rooney, I'm like, I'm more reading Becca than Sally Rooney. Right. So like there's this rivalry there. Yeah, that makes sense.
Like the gold standard of criticism is that you want to read somebody even when you have no interest in reading the book that they're writing about. And so that's kind of like a win in the critic column, I guess. And so maybe that's why.
Right. Okay, last question.
Thank you so much. 2 points of context. One, I had a class that ended late, so if this was already talked about and I missed it, feel free to skip it. And then the second is I love speech as a form of consuming information arts. That probably biases where my questions are coming from. There's two. The first one is something Professor Callard, you said about writing off of those like nuggets of wisdom that you can read and click. I often find that speeches have that for me more so than writing. So like a couple small examples are like big political speeches or David Foster Wallace's This Is Water, having like clear lines that I go back to. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And then the second would be technology and the relationship that will have to writing versus speech. Particularly what I'm curious about is if technology makes it so speech can be a more dynamic, engaging experience, i.e. I could be watching like in the metaverse, someone speaking years from now, would that change the values that we associate with writing versus speaking? Thank you again.
Great. So I think the thing, I'll start and then you can finish. You can be our last, you have last word. So with a lot of those speeches that you're mentioning, those were written down. I mean, so, and maybe this is the same thing I would say about both of these cases is that as technology also blurs these categories. It doesn't blur the underlying concepts, but it blurs like what counts as such, right? And so there's a way in which texting is like talking. Even though there's no sound, it's like talking. And a speech, you know, that's read out loud. I mean, if I wrote a speech, as I tend to write, like when I give speeches like to an audience, like if I have like a talk, a 50-minute talk, I tend to write it out word for word. Many philosophers don't do that. Many philosophers want to like be impromptu and stuff. But I'm like, no, but I'll formulate it better if I write it out. And so it's a spoken talk, but it's really written, even though they're hearing it. And so similarly with a lot of tech, we might end up having experiences that are, you know, text-like of speech. I think that's, I mean, maybe we'll just need different ways of drawing, we'll just need different like concepts or something, different ways of drawing distinctions so as to get at like the thing Becca's really interested in, which is like, do you get to take time to ruminate before you produce it? And do you get to produce a kind of artistic product? That could be a sound product, I take it. Or it could be like with, you know, symbols.
Yeah, I think that this question makes me realize that I haven't been clear enough, like even in my thinking, not just in my speaking, about the categories and how to distinguish them. And so I would have to think more carefully about exactly what it is about speech that bothers me, and whether it's specific to like voicing things or whether it clearly time is like a central preoccupation, like that you don't have time to meditate on your responses before you respond in speech. My inclination is to say that I just really even like the kinetic activity of writing. It's like a somatic exercise for me, as I say it was for Kafka and my Kafka piece. Like I noticed that when my computer breaks and I have to use someone else's unfamiliar keyboard, that prevents me from writing. It's like almost a choreography or something like that. I don't know where the keys are. That like really messes me up. So my inclination is to say that it's not just the temporal aspect that concerns me, but I would have to think more about it, because like I agree with Agnes that texting somebody like sort of in real time or like immediate responses are expected. Some of the things that are bad about it are some of the things that I am uncomfortable about with speaking.
Okay, thank you to those of you who stayed, and thank you to Rachel and William and Tyler and Becca. Thanks very much.
Thanks, guys. Okay, awesome. Wow, that was really long. Hey.
The reason for this is that that was part of the word, and that's why it's so hard to